The fiercest nations inhabit it, if indeed it can be called a habitation, when life is passed in wagons. They have no fixed abode, no germ of civilization. They indulge their sexual desires without restraint. Their women are not softened to modesty. They uncover the breast, from which they suspend their battle axes, and prefer warfare to marriage. In their climate too, there is the same rude nature. All things are torpid, all stiff with cold. Nothing there has the glow of life. Nothing, however, in Pontus, is so barbarous and sad, as the fact that Marcion was born there.
Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. I am Steven.
And I'm Daniel.
And that was our friend Tertullian destroying his enemies in one paragraph, but also managing to insult an entire region of the Roman Empire. That's my man. So, like I said, we're going to talk about Marcion, but before we do, if you like the content that you're getting from this channel, if you like the first 500-year series, please do consider subscribing and supporting us. Like the video, but then also leave us your comments. We do like to engage in the comments section on each video.
And tap the bell for notifications when a new episode drops.
Well, you don't have to wait till a new episode drops. You can actually tap the bell for notifications now, and then when an episode drops, you'll be notified. So, all right. So we're back in Pontus. You know, so that we left off at the last episode talking about Christians through the eyes of Romans. And the way that we did that was we took three main authors, right? We took Pliny the Younger, Galen, the philosopher, and then we also took Celsus, who's kind of a rhetorician. And so between those 3 points of view, we had a really nice, well-rounded picture of how Romans viewed Christians in the century. And, of course, the landscape was pretty complicated, you know, because they're trying to figure out, is this a superstition? Is it a philosophical school?
Association, a guild.
A guild. And we were particularly interested in the designation of a guild when we were talking about Pliny, because this region of Pontus and Bithynia, where Marcion is from, was originally a kingdom of its own, you know, and it was, you know, obviously annexed under the Roman Empire under Julius Caesar. And then later, what ends up happening is that Nero dissolves the monarchy there, like the line of succession. And so this is, you know, they're salty about that, of course. So by the time you come to the era that we're talking about, that's why any guilds, associations, people coming together was held in suspicion, right? But it's a hotbed of Christian activity, right?
It is. So remember from our earlier episodes that this was the geographic area where St. Peter was very active, the Petrine ministry. He writes to Pontus and Bithynia in the letters of Peter from Rome.
Right.
And so heavy in Petrine thought. So we wanted to re-enter this world again. You mentioned, you know, Pliny and him being governor there. It's also important because we're precedent for persecution. Like how is the Roman Empire legally going to handle these Christians? Yeah. And they set down precedents under Pliny's reign. So this is kind of the atmosphere that Marcion is growing up in. But we wanted to enter into first how Romans were seeing Christians, and then go to Marcion. Because we're kind of beginning to set the stage for what everybody has to talk about in the 2nd century, and that is the great apologists, right? So we first wanted to understand how the Romans are seeing it. Now we want to get into kind of the first major arch heretic, and then we'll enter into the world of the apologists as we move along in the series.
Right. So why you can hear it in the beginning, right? In Tertullian's quote, not only the vitriol against Pontus, but the vitriol against Marcion particularly, right? There seems to be
super harsh,
a very, very heated hatred towards this guy.
Yeah, and that should tip the historian off to tell you how important a figure he is. The more vitriol, probably the more impact that the heretic had at this time, and that's the case with Marcion. He's referred to as the Pontic Mouse. He's referred to as a barbarian. He's called a wasp. And even wasps make combs like bees do, and we'll get into what Tertullian means by that. But a lot of different names being thrown at Marcion. And the first time we hear of anything about this character, of course, nothing has survived from Marcion himself. But the first mention of him comes from Justin Martyr in his Apology, where we encounter the first charge against Marcion being that he's kind of left a monotheism, and we'll explore what that means. So the years we're talking here, Marcion's born probably in 85, dies in 160, but begins his quote-unquote ministry in Rome around 144, where he's rejected by the Roman presbyters there. So Justin's writing about him for the first time just a decade after that, and he's his contemporary. So the first word we get is kind of this mistrust about his monotheism. But Justin also wrote 5 books against him that are lost.
Yep.
Tertullian writes 5 books that we have. Origen writes against him. Clement of Alexandria writes against him. Irenaeus of Lyon, right? So literally all the major proto-Orthodox players are writing against Marcion. That's the importance of Marcion, obviously.
Yeah, and I think to round that out, I think a big reason why there's so much vitriol against him too is because of the uniqueness of what he does as a heretic. Qua heretic, what he does, and that is. We'll talk, but he starts his own church. So let's get there then. So let's start with just a quick biographical sketch of who Marcion is, what the arch of his life is. So, like you said, he's born in 85-ish, and he grows up in Pontus. Pontus is, just so you know where it is, it's a kingdom just south of the Black Sea, and particularly he grows up in Sinope. And in this city, you have mining is a big one, but also like shipping, right, and merchants and all this kind of stuff, and trade. And so Marcion was actually involved in shipping and in boats, right? What's interesting about that is that the mining aspect is that when people were sent to the mines, like Christians, when they were being persecuted and they would be sent to the mines, a lot of times it was actually to Sinope in Pontus. So that's where also what Marcion would have been seeing when he was coming of age. He would have been seeing Christians being sent to the mines in his own town. Now he is born to a very prestigious background because, at least in the Christian community, his father is reputedly Philologus, who, according to tradition, is mentioned right in the New Testament. Mentioned in the New Testament
in Timothy, I think, but he's by tradition a saint, and by tradition one of the 70 disciples of Christ who are sent out. So we know that from tradition. More specifically, from Epiphanius, writing against all heresies, the Panarion, he doesn't mention Marcion's father's name, but he does say a prominent old bishop from Sinope. So very well respected, not just in his geographic territory, but clearly respected also by Rome and the presbyters that were in Rome at the time.
Right. So for reasons unknown, but suggested in the apologists, they say that he was kicked out of his church in Sinope by his father.
Yeah, they charge sexual misconduct against virgins or something, but it could just be a charge.
Yeah, and that's we don't know if that's polemics or not, but either way, some kind of controversy happens, and he goes to Rome, like you said, and he's there in 140. And then, settles in to the Church of Rome at the time. Probably went into a little ethnic pocket in a way, right? Because he's coming from Anatolia, so there's a little bit of Anatolian. There's some Persian influence, some Greek influence. So he would have found a little pocket for himself.
Yeah, sure. Well, we know with Justin. Justin's from Syria. Justin found a little pocket for himself where he was receiving students and things that he was teaching Christian. So yeah, there was certainly Rome is that melting pot of the ancient world. He probably fell in maybe even with Justin Martyr's group. Maybe they even knew each other. Right. It's very possible, being Syrian.
Yeah, and Rome's a real interesting place at this time to be a heretic, or to spread.
It's high time to be a heretic here.
To spread a heresy because, not only, yes, it's the crossroads of the empire and you have all these ethnic pockets, you can reach a lot of different types of people very quickly and then have that message spread quickly. But also at the time in the Liber Pontificalis and in the Shepherd of Hermas, we get an indication that the Church of Rome is going through some kind of a struggle with the hierarchy. It's not clear what it is. Some people say that Pope Hyginus, I think it was at the time, was restructuring the Church of Rome.
Pius.
It's Hyginus in the beginning, and then Pius once. Yeah. So Pius is the one who comes to power when Marcion is excommunicated. Yeah. So it's actually under Pius that he's excommunicated. Now, Pius is actually the brother of Hermas. So it's really interesting. It's like all these connections. But what we know is that Marcion eventually begins to teach, and he's called to task by the presbyters. They call him before them so that they can judge his teaching, and he focuses in on the garment, right, and the patch. You don't put it, or the wine.
Yeah, the wine
skins.
skins. Yeah, the new and old wine skins.
Yeah, that seems to be the verse that he was focused on. That you don't put new wine into old wineskins. So they're debating about that.
Yeah, well, he gets there 142. He goes before the presbyters in 144, and it's over that question. He says, well, he goes to the presbyters and he says, how do you interpret this? And they interpret it, not necessarily allegorically, but they say, well, it's speaking to the spiritual condition of the Pharisees, that the old way, right? And now the new covenant has come. Kind of a traditional interpretation to that verse. And Marcion says to them, no, there's other ways to understand it. Now, Epiphanius, in recording this, doesn't go into detail about what Marcion's going to argue, particularly on that verse, but just that he wasn't in agreement with the presbyters. And in this episode, some folks will point to it and say that it also, by the way, shows that the Church of Rome didn't have a monopiscopate yet, because he's going to multiple plethora of presbyters. But if you read closely in the account, it says that Marcion chose these specific elders, presbyters, because they were disciples of the apostles, okay, or disciples of those who were disciples of the apostles. So these were old men, old presbyters,
the old ones, yeah.
Yep,
yeah.
And it's those ones that reject him and say not just that they don't agree with the teaching, but they say, and really they conclude that, well, if your father doesn't accept you, the good old bishop, then we can't accept you.
Which shows you that there's probably some credence there. That again, we don't know if his father really was one of the 70 or not, or any of that. But the point is that tradition wouldn't ascribe to somebody as being part of the 70 unless they had really strong apostolic pedigree. Right? So his father, Marcion's father, is an apostolic man, and that's why it's very powerful for the presbyters themselves to say, well, wait, your father's the one who kicked you out.
Yeah, well, at the very least, an apostolic man, because if Marcion's born in 85,
right,
his father is of the first century.
Yeah, exactly.
And obviously from the area where St. Peter was doing his ministry. So.
Yeah. So in terms of the location, what's kind of neat is that it's possible that where this happens, where Marcion is called, before the presbyters and is excommunicated, is the church of San Pudencia?
Pudenciana. Yeah. So interesting that church in Rome has the claim to being the oldest church in the city of Rome, the oldest continuing known church in the city of Rome, which we date it to, well, really the first century. So again, by tradition, it was the home of Pudens, a senatorial class in Rome, and it was the home where St. Peter was housed, where he would stay when he was in the city of Rome, where he would celebrate Eucharist, where he would gather the congregation in the community for fellowship. And so the tradition is that they have a piece of the altar table and the chair and all of that, which would be later transferred. But it happened in the house of Pudens. In the second, when you come to the 2nd century, archaeology tells us that in some way it was turned into a bathhouse, a Roman bathhouse. Novatus was Pudens' son, and they think maybe he turned it into a bathhouse. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. But the point is that it was somehow gifted back to the church. The bathhouse was in the 140s, and that's when Pius comes to the throne of Peter, and then Pius holds residence there and services. So he turns it into an oratory. He turns the bathhouse into a baptistry, and so once again the Christian community is gathering there on the tradition that this is where St. Peter used to gather.
Yeah,
and so That alone speaks to it probably being the house where Peter in the first century stayed, because Pius made it his residence, that this is where I'm going to reside. And the popes would continue to reside there until Constantine gifts them the Lateran. So it's an important center of early Christianity, but it's very possible that this is where, and you can look it up, Google, but it's possible this is where Marcion met with the presbyters and was excommunicated.
Super cool. So this is where the rubber meets the road, right? So he gets excommunicated, and I don't think the wheels were made of rubber back then, but but they did meet the road, and he does something that is kind of unfathomable. I mean, if you've listened to our previous episodes, we talked about heretics, and we've said there's people with other teachings who've been identified, and even Polycarp and John, and the stories about like, oh yeah, I know you're the firstborn of Satan, so it's nothing new. And even in the New Testament, I mean, even Revelation, like the Nicolaitans, the Jezebel, the prophetess, and so there's always been these quote unquote false teachers running around. But this is different. There's something different about Marcion in that he starts a parallel church.
And this is that's why Tertullian says that even wasps have combs. That's the reference to this.
Is he talking about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants?
Yeah.
I kid.
That yes, they look like the church. Mm-hmm. They're establishing churches, but they're wasps. They're not honeybees, right?
Right.
So they are establishing a parallel church, which, like you said, is something new. We've had followers of teachers, schools of thought, different opinions, different sects even. But to go so far as to establish literally a parallel church with a parallel hierarchy, bishops, priests, deacons apparently,
right.
The liturgy for all intents and purposes was probably very, very similar to the Proto-Orthodox liturgy.
Yeah. Well, Cyril of Jerusalem actually does mention this later. He says, when he's exhorting his congregation, he actually tells them, when they come to the city, not to accidentally walk into a Marcionite church by mistake. It's like that's how indistinguishable the liturgy was between the two.
So you can point to that. You can point to Epiphanius again, who he would have told us a lot more was different, but he only tells us that when they celebrate the mysteries, they allow the catechumens to stay, which is one difference. And then, and this would be a second big difference, in their Eucharist, they use water, which might sound odd to listeners, but actually that was a fairly widespread practice among a lot of second century Christians, some Jewish Christians, a lot of Christians who were part of more ascetical lean. And if you want to read more about that, Ascetic Eucharist by Dr. Andrew McGowan, he has a whole book on it, explaining why a lot of Christians were celebrating the Eucharist in that way. Mm-hmm. And a lot of different other foods too, but water was used in a lot of Eucharist, and so the Marcion churches did that. So he's only listing two liturgical things that would be different, so it kind of makes you think as a historian, well, they must have been pretty similar otherwise.
Right. But him establishing this parallel church too is interesting in another aspect, because, like we said, the heretics that we've talked about up to this point, in a way, we're kind of following that the model of the philosophical school, where it's like, here's the teacher, and around is gathered this. I mean, Justin Martyr was doing this. Justin Martyr was a teacher in Rome, a philosophical teacher who gathered pupils. So you have the philosopher in his Paideia, and you're definitely going to see that in Alexandria. I mean, it starts with Pantaenus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen. That's a straight line of succession in a philosophical school, but that's not a parallel church, right? It's like that's a separate thing. It's a catechetical kind of school, right. And that's what the other people were doing, right? Mm-hmm. We can surmise that maybe the Cerintheses of the world and it initially saw themselves as kind of part of the Christian community, but that's kind of what Ignatius is talking about in his letters. He's talking about people who he is their bishop.
Yeah, they're separating from the bishop,
right? Yeah, they're holding themselves aloof from their bishop,
from the altar.
It's not that they've gone and started another church, and he's like, "Hey, you can't do that." He's saying they're gathering and they're teaching, but they're not doing it under the authority of their own bishop.
Right.
This is different. So what Marcion is doing is he's establishing these parallel cult centers, and that's something to keep our eye on. Just generally
Yeah.
speaking. In the 2nd century and into the 3rd, this idea of the philosophical school of Christians and then the actual cultic centers with bishop, presbyter, and deacon. Because this will also, while it will produce great teachers of the faith, the philosophical school, it will also be a hotbed of heresies where heretics come up
And division.
And divisions.
The other thing I add there is that so in other words, that's number one. Why the vitriol, right? It's because he's doing this thing.
Right.
The other thing to mention is that this is the first time we're seeing it. Okay, even you're talking about other teachers had followers or whatever. Even if you look at the Jewish Christian groups that are out there, the Ebionites or the Nazarenes, the Ebionites had their own hierarchical structure as well. They did. But you could argue that was kind of from the beginning, and they kind of carved their own path. Same with Nazarenes. There's other Jewish Christian group we hear about, Jewish believer group we hear about in the 2nd century. But it's not even clear if they were even separate from the great Proto-Orthodox Church. They may even had been in communion with the great Proto-Orthodox Church and just kind of held separate Eucharists. But so again, Marcion is very unique in that sense.
Yeah. Now, this brings up an important point. So that's kind of Marcion's biography, right? And he dies in the 160s, but his movement and these churches continue, into 6th, 7th century. We still have witness of this. We even have a council where they were talking about how to receive Marcionites into the church. Yep. We have Islamic writings talking about Marcionites.
Now we're definitely in the 7th century.
Yeah. And of course that's at a time though where Marcionism, it's not clear whether it remained uniquely Marcionite or if it also had a lot of fluidity with Manichaeism and other Gnostic groups at that point. But either way, we know that this movement survives.
Well, not just survives, but thrives in many areas throughout the empire. It's very popular in Italy, North Africa, especially in Syria. I mean, St. Ephrem mentions that they're the majority church actually in Edessa. So if I were to go to ancient Edessa in the 3rd and 4th century and I asked, where's the church? They would point me to the Marcionite church. Right. And in fact, the Marcionites, who thought themselves to be Christians, and they called the Proto-Orthodox Church, the emerging great church, the Paulicians, after their bishop Paulut. So we call them Marcionites after Marcion, and then they're calling us Paulicians after a single man too. Yeah. So again, they see themselves as the original church over and against the great church.
Well, then you assume that they also had a lot of martyrs as well, right?
We have martyrdom accounts of Marcionites. The martyrdom of Pionius accounts not just Proto-Orthodox Christians dying, but dying alongside Marcionite bishops and others. And you look it up. There's in that account they even the author mentions how he's surprised at how many heretics are dying at the hands of the Romans. So yeah, the Marcion's churches did produce martyrs as well.
Okay, so we can start to get into a little bit of the doctrine then of what was his teaching.
Yeah, I think we can enter in with Irenaeus. We mentioned that Justin was the first to mention him, and then his 5 books are lost. But we can read from Irenaeus. I think he gives a good summary, and we can enter into it that way.
Okay.
So Irenaeus writes, Marcion shamelessly blasphemed the God announced by the law and the prophets, saying he is an evildoer, a lover of wars, inconstant in his judgments and contrary to himself. As for Jesus, he claimed that he came from that Father who is above the God who made the world into Judea in the time of the governor Pontius Pilate, Tiberius Caesar's procurator, and was revealed in human form to the inhabitants of Judea, abolishing the prophets and the law and all the works of that God who made the world, whom he also calls the Cosmocrator. Moreover, Marcion mutilates Luke's gospel, taking away from it all that is written of the Lord's birth, and much also from the teaching of the Lord's discourses, those passages where it is most plainly written that the Lord confessed the maker of this world to be his Father. And then he goes on talking about how he also carves up the letters of St. Paul to align with his own doctrine.
So, Yeah, if you're in your first year of school,
Heresy
school 101, the stereotypical take on Marcion's doctrine is that he's a polytheist. He departs from monotheism. He postulates two gods. There's the evil God, of the Old Testament, and Jesus came to reveal to us the true God, the high God,
an otherwise unknown God of love.
Yeah. And yes, the Old Testament God is a God of judgment, of justice, of retribution, of vengeance. The God of Jesus, the Father of Jesus, is a God of love, mercy, peace, forgiveness, redemption. So that's and so he completely divides the unity of the Testaments. It's not that the Old Testament, it has no purpose, but it's just that it just doesn't apply, anymore because that was the God of the Jews. Yeah. And we don't need that God. The other thing with Marcion's doctrine is, that you'd get in 101 Marcionism, is that he carved up the scriptures. So that's what you just mentioned, right? So he has this. He takes the Gospel of Luke, carves it up, takes the Pauline epistles, excises which ones he doesn't like, and he keeps a few that he does, and runs with that, and then writes this antithesis. So that's kind of like a stereotypical view of Marcion's doctrine. But what we want to do is really try to understand what Marcion was really teaching, and maybe where it's actually coming from. Because I think a lot of scholars kind of position, even if they don't explicitly, I think most scholars come at it thinking the backdrop of Marcion is kind of the Gnostic schools, or the emergent Gnosticism.
That was the old scholarship. Yeah, it was easier just to assume that he's part of that whole Gnostic thing. You got a few gods going on here. He's splitting up the scriptures. He's from eastern part of the empire. Maybe he's influenced by Persian dualism. Right. So there's a lot of other stuff going on. For the most part, modern scholars have moved away from that. They no longer really group Marcion in right. with the Gnostics.
Right. And thinking that he kind of fits more into that kind of philosophical school model, right? The school. Yeah. But like we said, no, these are cultic centers, which means that, he's doing something quite different than that.
And just on the surface of it, it doesn't, he was very, very successful. He was a very successful evangelist. To just on the surface say, oh yeah, he took a known canon and then carved it all up and then created churches. That would be a tough sell, I would think, right. In the empire, if that was exactly the case.
Right. Yeah. So, I what we would like to, hypothesize is that maybe a better context for understanding Marcion's doctrine and what he's coming up out of is the Jewish context, the Jewish Christian.
Yeah, I don't think you have to leave the Judeo-Christian milieu in order to explain right. not only his thought but also his success.
Right.
So, we mentioned Cerinthus already, and we've talked about him in previous episodes. Cerinthus was part of that kind of Judeo-Christian mindset. In fact, later Christian apologists thought Cerinthus was actually a Jewish Christian.
Right.
But there's a lot of debate going on within second century Judaism, first century Judaism, about how the world was created. Mm-hmm. Somebody like a Cerinthus, who may not be Jewish, but still in that worldview, thought that the God of the Old Testament created through the medium of a virtus, a power, a dunamis, created the world. Okay, so there's already a separation there. Jews are debating: was the world created through the mediation of angels? The angels did it.
Right.
So that layered thought is already kind of there in the second century.
Yeah.
So for Marcion to come along and say, "Well, I hear you. It is another power that created the world, not just right. mediated, but created the world."
Right. And and there's all kinds of streams of Judaism that you can look at too that were wrestling with the question, because like we talked about in the last episode, the doctrine of creation is the hot button topic. Creatio ex nihilo is not a settled Christian doctrine, at this time. Like, is God the creator or the fashioner? Like, mm-hmm. that's a real question on the table. Most Christians are saying that he created out of nothing. However, you do have these variant thoughts. Now, in Judaism, you have, for instance, Philo of Alexandria. So Philo associates the name Elohim with God's benevolence, and the title Kyrios, Lord, he associates it with like his sovereign power. Mm-hmm. So right there, we're already kind of
almost sounds like a modalism almost.
Yeah,
God acts in these different modes.
Yeah. And the rabbinical tradition, what they were doing at this time was pointing out, at least, that when God acts benevolently in the Old Testament, he does it directly. So when every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, it comes straight down from the Father of lights. But for acts of
like manna or something,
right? Like you look at like the manna in the desert, exactly. That just comes straight down from heaven from God directly. But when it's time for retribution, when it's time for judgment, it's I will send the Babylonians, right? So there's this agency through which God executes his justice and his judgment. So that's kind of the rabbinical tradition. But then you also have the Targumic tradition. And there are Targums, which do you want to remind our audience what the Targums are?
Well, it's basically a commentary on Genesis, the Old Testament. It was first an oral tradition and then later written down. Oral tradition on commenting on it and further expanding the Genesis tradition by Palestinian Jews.
Right. So in that tradition, you have a debate between Cain and Abel, and they're debating about whether the world was created by God through mercy or out of mercy or through justice. And so they have that debate, and then Cain basically, resolves it, and he says, well, it was like he judges the world through mercy.
So already that dichotomy that's going to be so apparent in Marcion is already in the air, kind of.
Yeah. And I think so. Once you know that creation, these binaries that they're dealing with, justice, mercy, benevolence, vengeance, that's all in the air in Judaism. But then you add the other layer of what we talked about in a previous episode. So when you go back and look at was Judaism ever monotheistic? That adds another layer of nuance when we're talking about the divine counsel aspect of things, that there's God, there's El Elyon, but then you have his divine counsel. And you have the Deuteronomy commentary on the Babel event. Yeah,
Deuteronomy 32.
Where you have, the nations are basically given their gods. They're angels, they're members of the divine council.
Divine beings, yeah.
And those divine beings were originally supposed to lead the people back to God, but then eventually they become corrupted. We talked about that. So if you haven't heard about that, go back to that episode. But zeroing in on this, I could see where Marcion would look at that, where it says, but Israel was Yahweh's portion. Mm-hmm. So if you're Marcion, you could look at that and say, see, Yahweh is just one of the lesser gods, like all the other ones. Mm-hmm. And the Jews were his portion.
Yeah.
So you add that, right? And so we're not talking about a raw dualism. I mean, when we say dualism, we mean two equal powers battling it out and who's going to win.
No, Marcion is much more nuanced than
right.
that. Yeah.
Marcion, I mean, he's in a way he could be like an El Elyonist. There's a high God, but it's a God, it's an unknown God. It's a God that we've never known before, and everybody was mistakenly assuming that the God of the Old Testament was this high God. Mm-hmm. But no, that's what Jesus comes, and that's the peculiarity of Jesus' ministry in his eyes, right? This is you could even imagine him saying like, well, yeah, look at how Jesus even talks about Father this, Father that, telling us to call him Father. No one has seen the Father at any time, only the Son. You're like, well, then what was all that Moses talk?
Yeah. So there's an irony there, then, isn't there? Because Marcion is seen as on this extreme end of anti-Judaism, right, knocking out the whole Old Testament, starting new with the New Covenant, all that. But as you can see here, just by this short survey, he's indebted to Jewish thought. And he's in a heavily Jewish area. Don't forget that. I mean, a lot of the Jewish believers in Jesus are in this territory. Syria, Anatolia. Okay, heavily Jewish influence here on his thought.
Yeah. So,
I will say, I do want to say this, though. I don't want to lose the historical context. So think about...
Let's forget that.
think about okay, it's year one. It's in the 140s. What just happened 10 years before that? The Bar Kokhba revolt.
Right. It was a big fail.
A huge fail for Messianism, for the Jews. And not only was it going to prove Marcion right, that's a bunch of hogwash, but the anti-Judaism that's in the air, even among those who are thinking in Jewish ways and in Jewish circles, is very, very prominent as you come out of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Everybody the rest of the empire did not like what happened there,
right?
That revolt. And so there is this backlash you see against Jews in general at this time, 130s, 140s.
Well, apart from that, though, apart from just like people, having this bitterness towards the Jews because of that, you also might have had within the Jewish community itself a self-doubt of saying, maybe some people within the Jewish community were ripe then for Marcion's message to say, this God of the Old Testament,
yeah,
it's not working out, is it?
Right.
So, you might have had a lot of despondency. I mean, you're talking about people who committed mass suicide, for crying out loud. You had families wiped out. I mean, you don't know what that does to the psychology of the community.
And that's why we kind of, I think, maybe implied it or alluded to it. Marcion is not a chilly ass. He doesn't. So the 1,000-year reign of the Messiah, okay, he just saw it fail again, this Messiah political Messianism. So he departs from that. And a lot of the church fathers don't, actually. A lot of the early church fathers would also agree that there is, based on Revelation, there is this 1,000-year reign that's going to be there. Marcion rejects that. And the irony of that is that the later church also would reject that view. Yeah. So again, it's all in this area. You don't have to move outside of it. It's within Syria and Anatolia and Judaism and Judeo-Christianity that's feeding not only Marcion's thought, but like you said, the attractiveness of his thought.
Right. So yeah, let's really dive in here to his view then of how he comes to this view. So Tertullian tells us that Marcion was obsessed with the question of the problem of evil. Mm-hmm. So that was his preoccupation. The other thing is that he did not admit an allegorical reading of the Old Testament texts, which Christians had already kind of been, even Jews, had been accustomed to doing.
Yeah, Jews have been accustomed to do it since Philo. Philo was really groundbreaking in that for the Jewish scriptures. Mm-hmm. And then we saw it in the earliest documents of the church, in the letter of Barnabas, highly allegorized, right, and typology very, very heavily. And then you certainly get it with the onset of the Christian philosophers like Justin, mm-hmm, like Clement, Origen. So the church is fully embracing allegorical interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah. But once again, Marcion's kind of taking a conservative road, and he's more of a biblicist, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah, he fully explores these apparent tensions between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God as presented. And his conclusion is that these are two distinct gods, no apologies, right? And that's because of this problem of evil that preoccupies his thinking. And it's not that, I don't want people to think that he thought that the Old Testament God was evil.
Right. Yeah.
That's not what he's after.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying the Old Testament God is a lesser God, mm-hmm, therefore imperfect. He's the God that oversees the world of becoming.
Right.
So change, chance, the changes and chances of this mortal life is basically what this God is in charge of.
A fickleness.
This God is fickle. This God changes his mind. He repents and decides not to do evil when he had intended to do so. He gets angry. He causes wars. Right. So he's seeing that, and he's saying, well, that can't be God.
Yeah.
That can't be, that's not compatible with what we know of God, mm-hmm, in the philosophical tradition, right?
Right. So, and that's what's going to do it, right, for the earliest presbyters that excommunicate him. That's it right there. There's a great article by Dr. Louis Ayres, one of the top patristic scholars in the world. But he had this little article, and sometimes the smallest articles are sometimes the best and most groundbreaking. So for a long time, obviously it was vogue in scholarship to see tons of diversity in the early church. We've kind of mentioned that before, that every document that comes up in the church is a new sect. Okay, that means it's a new sect. What Ayers points out is that the fact of the matter remains this, that before the year 130, every single Christian document, doesn't matter if it's a gospel, a treatise, a letter, doesn't matter what genre it is, every single one of them betrays a narrative pattern that is exactly the same. A narrative pattern that the Christ is the Son of the Father who created the universe, and that Christ came to earth, discipled us, gave us the Holy Spirit, and is going to come back for us. Mm-hmm. That basic narrative pattern is what is binding these second century churches together. Because there's going to be various opinions in those. But that narrative has always been there. And that is the sense of unity that's there for the proto-Orthodox, or the emerging great church, as we call it. So what Marcion did is he came and presented this narrative of a lesser God. And he's not the father of Jesus. Jesus is this unknown father.
Right.
That broke the narrative right there. And that was the great offense of Marcion. You can tell in the first sources, because they're talking about his monotheism is off. Something is off with that.
So he still has to compensate, though, right? Because obviously, there's still Old Testament prophecies about a Messiah, right? And this is in the air. So how does Marcion resolve that piece?
Well,
right?
It's for the Jews.
Right.
That lesser God is leading the Jews wherever that lesser God's going. Just like the rest of the nations have their gods who are leading them wherever.
Yeah.
The hope is eventually they'll accept Marcionite's gospel,
right.
The Marcionite gospel. But let that lesser God play out. It doesn't matter to me.
So in other words, he has not only a two gods theory, he also does have a two messiahs theory, because what he's saying is that, this Old Testament God of the Jews is going to do his duty for the Jewish people in his own way. And that Messiah, that Jewish Messiah, is still yet to come. And he's going to do all the things that it says. He's going to restore the kingdom to Israel. He's going to,
Well, isn't that funny, though? Because that's exactly what the rabbis were debating.
Right.
The rabbis posited maybe there's two messiahs going on here. I think we mentioned that in our Jewish episodes. But so again, he's very much established in this thought, in this the air that he's breathing is Jewish.
So in other words, the prophecies of the Old Testament talking about the Messiah are actually not necessarily talking about the coming of Jesus.
Right.
Good. And what's also unique about Marcion, I wanted to remember to say, is that basically, the philosophers talk about the demiurge, right? This intermediate being or power that that connects the world of the transcendent God with the immanence of creation, because the transcendent God can't interact directly with it, right? So there's this intermediate power. See, Plato and the philosophers would say that power was also good. But see, what Marcion does is he's almost playing on the demiurge concept in a way, but the difference is that this is fickle, right, and imperfect. So that might even be an indication, either that he's kind of adapting the philosophical model with the Jewish whatever, or that again he's not coming from that model. It's it's one way or the other.
Well, we are told that he fell in with a man named Cerdo.
Yeah, in Rome.
Rome, who he became a disciple for a short time.
Right.
We don't know Cerdo's background, but Cerdo was teaching a high God and a lower God, and the lower God is a creator. We don't know much about that. It could just be the apologists kind of grouping him with Cerdo because their doctrines were maybe similar.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we don't know.
Right. So that's Marcion's view of God, right? The Old Testament. How about a quick word then on his view of Jesus himself, right? His Christology in a way.
Yeah, his Christology is interesting too, because in some ways, we're told that he rejects the virgin birth.
Right.
We're told that, and the evidence for that presented by the apologists is that he took out the birth narrative from the Gospel of Luke, and his gospel begins with that Jesus arrives in Capernaum. He just kind of appears in Capernaum. There's almost a little bit. There's a similarity there, isn't it, with the adoptionist Christians, with the Ebionites, the Jewish believers in Jesus groups, who believe that Jesus was adopted into divinity, adopted into the Godhead, and
He was a man.
He was a
right?
man. Yeah. Almost something similar there going on with Marcion as well. So Jesus is a man. He appears, but maybe the virgin birth is denied. But Marcion is not like the Docetists. He does believe that Jesus died and suffered on the cross,
Right.
And rose again, according to the scriptures.
Well, that's the interesting thing about him is that he confesses that Jesus has a body. Now, in the ancient world, the word body, that's a very complicated word. For us,
even among the emerging church, the great church.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's the bodies of angels, there's the bodies of humans. There's different. The definition of body is much broader, in other words, than what it is for us, right? For body, for us, it's like organic flesh and DNA and all these things, but they didn't think like that. So what we get from Marcion is kind of this. It's kind of a really early attempt at like, no, I'm gonna postulate a Christology. So regarding the virgin birth, right, and that being absent, so like we would say born of the Virgin Mary in our creed. For him, the formula was having been made manifest in hominis forma, coming into Judea. So in the form of a man,
which should sound familiar to folks if you read Philippians, because St. Paul says the same thing.
Right, it's a Pauline formula, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And Tertullian actually accuses him of saying, as a formula again, that Jesus was, quote, flesh and not flesh, man and not man. So it sounds like he's wrestling with the age-old question that's going to preoccupy the church for the next few hundred years, and that's how do we understand that Jesus is God and man, right? And so Marcion is kind of putting forward.
This is where I think the apologists have their weakest argument, because I think they're just grouping Marcion a lot of times in with other groups that they know deny the flesh or like the Docetists or whatever.
Right.
Is Jesus a phantom?
One of his Marcion's later, disciples of Marcionism is Apelles, and Apelles is the one who starts the idea of there being a putativus flesh or illusory flesh. He starts, using the word phantasma to talk about what kind of a body it is. And it's funny that it's in Luke's gospel that we get that episode where Jesus says, like, come and get, let me eat, right? I'll show you I'm not a phantom. And he's phantasm. So that's interesting that, you have like a lot of these connections. But overall, all that we really know is that Marcion does confess some kind of a body and a type of humanity to Jesus, and that he does go to the cross. So he's not like these docetics, these radical docetics earlier that we heard about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it could just very well be a kind of interpretation on St. Paul, who says that we will, in the resurrection, we'll have spiritual bodies. What does he mean by that?
Right.
The church eventually will come to say what it is, but Marcion is still in that age where it's being thought about.
Yeah.
And he's giving a proposal.
Yeah. And Paul, I mean, that's a perfect example because Paul calls, the bread which you eat, he calls it spiritual food, but then he says it's the body of Jesus. So you have this connection between spiritual and then he says it'll be, sown a fleshly body, but raised a spiritual one, using the word pneumatikon. So he's using the same term to talk about body. So you can see where this could go. We don't know if this is where Marcion goes, but you can just see that like it's more complicated maybe, right? Underneath the surface. It's not as easy just to say that, oh yeah, he's a docetic,
Yep. Yeah. Well, think about the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark does not have a birth narrative.
Right.
So was the Gospel of Mark denying the virgin birth? I mean,
right.
Again, we're hearing. I wish we had Justin's 5 books. We don't. We're hearing from Tertullian for the most part on Marcion. That's year 207 when he's writing that. So he's a little bit removed.
Yeah. So all right. So we have Marcion's kind of doctrine of creation. We have his view of the Old Testament God. We have his view of Christ. At least we're what we can glean. Let's talk about the scripture thing. Marcion, the scripture carver.
Yeah.
It was Marcion's canon what the apologists kind of were saying it was, kind of like an ancient version of like the Jefferson Bible, where he just kind of goes through and takes the stuff he likes and gets rid of the stuff he doesn't.
Yeah. So, again, the church doesn't have a settled canon. They don't have a closed canon, but they generally know the wider canon.
They have a canon that's open.
Yeah, a canon that's open.
They know where it is, but where it ends is not yet defined.
So one could say, if you wanted to get into Marcion's mind, into his own boots or sandals, you would say, well, what he's trying to do is propose a solution for the church. Mm-hmm. To say, look, we have all these kind of books. Some churches are disputing these. Like, for example, you guys over there don't use Revelation in your liturgies. You guys don't have any of the pastoral epistles. Well, let's just get rid of those and let's stick to St. Paul. You could argue that that's what he was doing, saying, hey, let's be a little more conservative here. We know these are St. Paul's letters. Let's use these 10, and that's our canon.
Because we all agree on these. You can almost see it as like a conservative position that he's taken.
And then as far as the gospel, if you were to come to Marcion's defense, like I said, Mark's is a truncated gospel as well. Mm-hmm. According to even Tertullian, Marcion was claiming that his gospel was original, and that Marcion would say that there is no author to my gospel. It's just what we received. It's the original.
Yeah.
Whereas Tertullian would turn that around and say, you don't even know who wrote your gospel. It's yours, probably, right? But we know who wrote our gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, apostolic men or apostles themselves. But there have been some scholars recently that have written on this. I think the one article that's really good is Marcion and his gospel and the synoptic problem. And in that, scholars are re-looking at what we call the synoptic problem, right? So in scholarship, there's been kind of two shortfalls when it comes to looking at the Gospels, okay, and Marcion. The first thing is we always were assuming that Luke's Gospel came before the one that Marcion had in his hand.
Right.
Is that necessarily true? Okay. The second is that scholars for a very long time, or still, are obsessed with the Q hypothesis. Okay, so the Q hypothesis is that there must have been this common source of Jesus's doings and sayings that then the synoptic writers used as their source to write down their gospels. Mm-hmm. And that has been a leading theory for decades and decades, the Q gospel, right? The only problem with that is that we've never found a Q gospel. We've never found a source that actually exists, a tangible source that, oh yeah, this is the one that they were using. So that just remains in theory land. Yeah. Some modern scholars have proposed that well, let's not assume Luke's priority, and let's not say that Q exists. What if we slipped this Marcion gospel in there?
Yeah.
What if Marcion's gospel was actually original, or kind of an original document, or at least contemporary to the other synoptics? Maybe it was written in the 70s or 80s or compiled in the 70s and 80s like Luke was. Yeah. And it's just a truncated version of it. And then Marcion takes it over. So that's been argued in the last couple decades. That's a cool argument. Yeah, and there are there's some good things in there. I mean, if you read the article or whatever, he'll point out instances in the gospel where it seems like, wait a minute, Luke seems to be getting that actually from Marcion's gospel, not the other way around. That's right. Odd. So yeah, just things like that.
Well, also it would be like crazy unique, right, in the history of texts for somebody to just excise a bunch of stuff, but not.
Yeah, in all of the ancient world, when you have somebody who's playing editor or translator or scribe, and they're excising things, there'll also be interpolations. There'll also be adding things. Right. They'll be adding their theology. Yeah. But the apologists never admit that. They never say that Marcion added anything. They only say that he took away.
That's significant. Yeah.
Well, I think so. I mean, that would be literally the only instance from late antiquity of that practice being practiced by an editor. So that seems a little odd. Now, Tertullian himself admits that Marcion's followers in Book 4, if you want to read about, Marcion, go to Book 4 of Tertullian's treatise, more in depth. But he says in there that Marcion's followers continued to edit.
Mm.
So again, what originally did Marcion what was Marcion up to?
Right.
Specifically, it's a lot more clouded. So the picture, what we're saying is the picture's a little dirtier than what even the apologists could have known about Marcion, because they're writing, or at least what we have from Tertullian, he's writing 4 decades at least after Marcion's already dead, and he tells us that his followers are still editing and changing and developing their theology and things.
Well, plus some of the strongest arguments in Tertullian and the apologists are actually excerpts of Marcion's gospel that they all hold in common, and it's like, why would Marcion keep that in there?
Right. Yeah. So Epiphanius lists, like, I think it's 78 instances of where Marcion in his canon is either quotes the Old Testament, references the keeps those parts in, or
Right.
references Jesus' body, or whatever it is. There's an instance that shouldn't be in there if Marcion's theology was as Tertullian was saying it was.
Well, and if he was a
harshly-
scripture carver, if he
Right.
was just going in and like,
Yeah.
let's go, like rolls
Yeah.
up his sleeves and starts carving up the scriptures, there's obvious passages that you'd want to take out if you were him, and he keeps them.
Yeah, and again, Tertullian would say and does say that, well, Marcion, I can go to your own canon and prove you wrong.
Right.
Well, maybe Marcion's take was a little more nuanced than what the apologists had thought.
Yeah. And, again, if we're talking about his father, being Philologus, and you can maybe even imagine when Paul says in his letters, according to my gospel. A lot of times the later fathers will identify that like with Luke, the Gospel of Luke, but maybe Marcion in his mind is saying, oh yeah, that's this gospel, this early gospel that I have.
there have been some that suggested that, because there is a part in where Tertullian says that Marcion, there's no author to yours. You should have at least claimed Paul as the author. Then you would have had some authority kind of in Tertullian's way. So Tertullian's treatise, there's a lot of vitriol in it. There's a lot of smarts in it, right? Obviously, there's a lot of pointed, good attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Marcion's doing something wrong. His Christology's off in some way.
Yeah.
His idea about God is off, clearly. But there are mistakes in Tertullian as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's instances where, I think 2 or 3 instances where Tertullian says that Marcion excised these things from Luke's gospel, but in actuality, it's from Matthew's gospel that they come from, not from Luke's. So he was kind of incorrect in viewing it as an excising of it. So again, it's super complicated, I guess, is the point.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that Marcion wasn't wrong. He certainly, from what we can tell, was wrong.
He also has this peculiar thing Marcion does where, and I don't know if it's because he's just being accused of it or whether, it was something he actually thought, but he definitely saw Paul as the one who got Jesus right, who understood Jesus, and the other apostles got him wrong and were kind of Judaizers.
Yeah.
And then stretching that back into the Old Testament, he has this soteriology, this account of soteriology, where all of the patriarchs and prophets and stuff of the Old Testament ended up damned. And all of the sinners that we read about, and then, of course, following all the way through into the gospel, those are the people who end up repenting and being saved.
Because they followed the patriarchs followed the lesser God.
Because even when Jesus goes and preaches to the patriarchs and prophets of old, when he descends, the idea is that they actually don't repent. They're not repent, but they don't believe in Jesus, and they stick to the Old Testament God, this lesser God. So again, now we have to think now. Okay, so we have, again, Marcion's doctrine of creation, doctrine of God, doctrine of Jesus, this canon question. But why would this be convincing? Anyway, it's like, how do we get into the minds of the people at the time and to kind of hear what would this sound like to their ears and why would this be convincing because it sounds so radical.
Number one, I think it appeals to a majority Gentile population that doesn't want to really deal with the Old Testament. They're excited about a new revelation of. They want to keep
their their stuff the way it is.
Yeah, but I think in a way, Marcion, you could say, is leeching off this. Whatever was successful for the great church is going to be successful for Marcion. I think the same techniques. I mean, he's preaching. His soteriology is faith based.
Yeah,
faith for salvation. Same as the church. It's not like the Gnostics who have this esoteric knowledge is the base of salvation. No, he maintains that faith based is the way. The way he organizes his churches, I think, is important. He's mimicking how the church is doing that. I think that makes him successful. But he writes his great work is what we call the antitheses. And I think he was a great evangelist in this, in that he didn't write these long, grand theological treatises. All he did was get his disciples, his catechumens, within a certain mind frame, within a certain, to start thinking like he thinks.
He tills the soil of their mind and then lets them go and read it.
Yeah. So, what were the antitheses?
Right.
They were. It was a document that he had compiled, put together, and kind of prefixed it to his canon as a teaching tool to his catechumens. And what it was is he would take in juxtaposition an Old Testament paraphrase of the Old Testament or an event in the Old Testament, and he would find kind of typologically its opposite in the New Testament, and he would just pose it.
Put those in front of you.
Put those in front of you. And imagine going through that and reading hundreds of these.
Yeah.
And then going and reading St. Paul, for example. And this is why, you mentioned it, and I want to get back to it. This is why, this was his reason, or the reason the apologists said he was doing it, why he carved up St. Paul. Because he felt like, if this doesn't comport, then there must have been Judaizers putting this into St. Paul's letters, and I need to get rid of that stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So even there, his intent was to let's get to the original Paul. Let's clean it out, because these are clearly additions to the text. But I think his method was super, super important and very, very effective.
Yeah, I love it. Actually, let's just listen to what this exegetical method would have sounded like.
Yeah, sure. We have a 3rd century document called the Dialogue of Adamantius,
which is a great name, by the
way. And in this document, it's kind of a dialogue back and forth between Marcionite Christians and Orthodox Christians at the time. Yeah. But we think that, just because of the way it's structured, we think that they may have been paraphrasing or taking from the antitheses, which no longer is extant to us. So we can kind of maybe get a glimpse of it from this document.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So the Marcionite would say, "The God of creation ordered Moses, when he was heading out of Egypt, saying, 'Make yourself ready by girding your loins, shodding your feet, taking staves in your hand and your purses, and take gold and silver and all the rest from the Egyptians.' But our good Lord, sending his disciples into the world, says, 'Neither sandals on your feet, nor purse, nor 2 tunics, nor money in your belt. See how the good one clearly opposes the teachings of that one.' The prophet of the God of creation, so that he might kill more when he was fighting, did not allow the sun to set until he finished killing those fighting against the people. But the Lord, since he is good, says, 'Do not allow the sun to set on your anger.' The prophet of the God of creation, when war was stirred up against the people, climbing to the peak of the mountain, stretched out his hands to God, so that he might kill many in battle. But our Lord, since he is good, stretched out his hands not to kill men, but to save them. What then is similar? Through stretching out his hands that one kills, this one saves."
Bingo. Marcion. All right. So what I love about reading that and listening to that with the antitheses is you can kind of see the structure of it. So it's just as X in the Old Testament, So now why in the new? That's the structure of each one of those. That is remarkably similar to Irenaeus's recapitulation method. So for those who don't know, recapitulation, which means basically the summing up of all things under the headship of Jesus Christ. And this was an Irenaean kind of principle. If you were to like study the apologists for the first time and you're going through, you kind of, if you're in a 101 apologetics class or something, it's going to be like, okay, Justin Martyr, what do you need to know? Logos spermaticus, that's the big principle.
I was going to guess, but okay.
Irenaeus, it's going to be recapitulation.
Apostolic succession.
Apostolic succession. So yeah, like when we're talking about recapitulation, what it is it's where Irenaeus will look back in the Old Testament and he'll zero in on a text and typologically show you how it prefigured Christ. But not just that, but that when Christ performs what he does, he reverses the evils of what happened. So, it would sound something like, okay, just as Adam, damned the human race by eating from the tree, now in the new covenant, Jesus, the new Adam, saves humanity by hanging from a tree, right? And then feeding us with his flesh, like to become the food from that tree. Or the one he's most famous for is the new Eve thing, right? Where you have the old Eve who says no, or I'm sorry, who says yes to the serpent, and everybody falls. This new Eve, Mary, says yes to the angel and says, "Let it be to me according to your word." And so then that aspect of the fault is reversed. What's interesting about that is that postdates Marcion. That principle, that method.
Yeah.
So it's possible that what Irenaeus was doing, whereas Marcion is like literal reading of the Old Testament, and then I'm going to show you how, even if you were to do something typologically here, it's opposed. Right? What Irenaeus is doing is saying, no, you read the Old Testament typologically, and what it shows you is that it was written so that these things would be reversed. These evils would be reversed. Whereas Marcion would say, look at the evil there, look at the good here. And so Marcion would divide the testaments through that method.
Well, and it's super effective. If you look in the Old Testament, right? So the prophets go into battle and they win this battle, okay? Irenaeus would look at that and interpret that and say, right. It's a type of Christ who's going to win the spiritual battle.
Yeah,
against
he's
the
saying
demons.
Moses raises his hands, and then is winning the battle and killing more people, right? And then Jesus raises his hands, dies, right, but saves the people. And so Marcion sees that as demonstrating the disunity of the Testaments. But what Irenaeus would say is saying, no, what are you talking about? Moses is vanquishing the enemies of God by holding arms up. Now Jesus does the same thing in the new covenant, and it's the demons. He's defeating the demons.
That's great. Yeah, I know. I love that idea that the whole recapitulation is kind of an answer to Marcion. I don't know if I've read that in scholars, but it's an enticing proposal.
Yeah, and it's more than that, I think what it does, though, is that if that's the case, it demonstrates the effectiveness of what Marcion was doing. Just those one-liners, it's like you don't have to be educated to know that.
Right.
And when you're talking about Gentiles who are coming from a world where the Jews were suspect, their religion was suspect. It was exclusive. You're coming in as a Gentile, you're new, you're coming to this thing, and then someone says, like, listen, that's the God of the Jews. You don't need that.
Yeah. The burden's gone. That's easy.
You can
That's
see
easier.
yourself, maybe you're a Gentile catechumen, right? Or something, and then you encounter Marcionism, and you're like, well, that sounds a little bit more friendly, to what I'm already used to. So you could see maybe how he picked up a ton of Gentiles, with this.
Picking up Gentiles.
This method.
Yeah.
Come on in.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, but the antitheses as a method, I think, is really, really powerful. So all of that, then, that's Marcion. That's his doctrine. That's his life. That's what we know of him. How are the apologists going to respond to this? What is it that they're going to do?
Yeah. So the apologists may have been mistaken on some points, may have gotten some things wrong, may have been a little mean. Stakes are high.
I'm actually fine with it.
Yeah, no, it's fun read. It's a fun read. In general, they obviously got Marcion right, that something is off here.
Yeah,
it's not what we received, and they put up these three defenses that become so important to the church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
I brought out this 3-legged table just for this moment.
Oh yeah, so the 3-legged table of the apologists, they're going to use against not just Marcion, but all of these sects that begin to grow up in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Creed, canon, and episcopate.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the 3 defenses that the church is going to employ, that all the apologists employ against Marcion. When you think about the creed, we're talking about the rule of faith, right? Yeah. The regula. The general, again, pattern that was received in the church and believed on by the majority. Like this is what it is. And if what you're saying doesn't comport with that, then I can't accept it.
Yeah, the regula fidei, like you said, the rule of faith is basically it's the expanding and growing, commentary on the baptismal formula, right? Of baptizing them in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That there's a unity of between those 3. But it's not just a unity of identity, but it's a unity of story. There's a narrative, like you said, that ties that all together.
That ties the Creator to the Messiah,
right?
To Christ Himself,
right? And so they're saying, like, if you hear something that doesn't comport with that narrative, you know that it's something else. Something
else is happening.
Yeah, and that's what they heard in Marcion. They heard a story that they were not accustomed to hearing.
Yeah, and that was the point of departure for all great theologians in the first couple centuries there. I think of Origen, we'll get to. He begins his great work, First Principles, on literally speaking to the rule of faith that has been received in the church. And then from there, let's theologize. But this must be accepted. This here must be accepted.
And this is what I think is very important at this point for, like, say, our Protestant, dialogue partners or friends or whatever. It's that at this time they're using that narrative to decide even what belongs in the liturgy and being read in the liturgy canon, right? So they're using the regula fidei also to determine whether or not a certain writing is canon or not, because they know that narrative is inviolable. Like, that is something that is the narrative that we received in the preaching of the apostles, and you can't transgress it.
Yeah, and so, like we said, the canon, maybe it's not closed, but it's there, and the majority church knows it's there. Yeah, and so they're going to go at Marcion and say, you're missing kind of the rest of it. Where's the
canon's too small.
It's too small
already.
It's too small already. So they propose that, and then of course episcopate, that we know the successors of the apostles. You just went out and you started your own little line of succession, but we can point to, and Irenaeus famously does, the bishops throughout the whole world. I have lists,
right.
And I even have the list of the bishops of Rome.
Right.
And this is what they have taught.
And Marcion may have leaned into, for those who didn't know about the controversy in Rome and that he was excommunicated, before that news reaches other places, he may have taken advantage of the moment and said, well, listen, hey, my father is XYZ, whether it's Philologus or not, right? But it's a man of great apostolic renown. He may have leaned into that as a stamp on his authority to establish churches. So all the more does it become powerful for the apologists, someone like an Irenaeus or a Tertullian, to say, hey, go to the churches of Syria, go to the churches of Asia Minor, go ask them, like, where's this, where's that, right? And then going through the succession lists and saying, and then finally, Tertullian says, and then finally you come upon Rome, where Peter and Paul spilled forth their blood and their doctrine, right? So now we're in the point where we're talking about the episcopate. This is where the apologists then are also saying, not only are you talking about the grand narrative of the regula fidei or the canon of Scripture, but also the bishops. I mean, like, these are the men who are still sitting in the chairs, the physical chairs from which the apostles taught.
Yeah.
Tertullian zeroes in on that with Rome, especially. Where he
The
says,
chair's there.
That's where the chair is.
Yeah.
And it's called the pro consanguitate doctrinae, the idea of the common blood of doctrine. He says, so, the two premier apostles spilled forth their blood and doctrine on Rome, and then from them we received in Carthage our doctrine as well, right? And now our bishop sits, on his episcopal throne, which gets its stamp of approval because of his agreement with the premier church, right?
Right. So I'll just read a little section from Tertullian, just so we got a sense of how he uses these kind of pillars.
Sure, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. In Book 4, Chapter 2, Tertullian writes, "Of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards. These all start with the same principles of the faith, regulis, so far as relates to the one only God, the Creator, and his Christ, how that he was born of the Virgin, and came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Never mind if there does occur some variation, the order of their narratives, provided that there be agreement in the essential matter, in which there is disagreement with Marcion. Marcion, on the other hand, you must know, ascribes no author to his gospel." So right there in that reading, he's not just saying, hey, the canon, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the church has received all four of these, not just one. So even if your gospel was original, you're missing the rest of it.
Right.
Okay, so if there's 5 gospels, you ought to have 5 gospels. Okay. And then you see he's kind of paraphrasing the Regula Fidei, the creed. God the Creator and his Christ and the virgin birth all wrapped into one, right? And then he goes into it. So he's referencing the canon or the creed,
Right.
the rule of faith, in his defense. And you see that up and down the apologists.
Yeah, and that's going to become the blueprint. That'll be the template for arguing against basically all the early heretics. It's just going to be...
Yeah, because again, look, Marcion is convincing. He's winning converts all over the empire.
Right.
He's convincing in his interpretation of the scriptures. So what other authority is going to decide these things? We have to look to something else. And this is the church saying, the church. The church is what we received. It's canon and it's bishops.
Well, that's a good segue because
Oh, thanks.
we should talk then and maybe start to wrap up with a discussion of kind of some of, as Catholics, right, some of our takeaways from this narrative.
Sure.
Because yes, I mean, of course, yes, Marcionism continues for some centuries, but don't make the mistake of thinking that therefore it's not clear where the great tradition is as the centuries roll on. It'll become very clear, which is why you'll see like Marcionism have to kind of forge alliances with Manichaeism and Gnosticism. And
But that's how the church often worked, is that it comes up against a problem, and then church gives its answer finally.
Yeah.
It rubs. So like, we were suggesting that when Marcion proposes his typology or whatever, then the church comes up with recapitulation, develops that. When Marcion proposes his canon, well, the church is going to eventually close that canon.
Right.
We know of, from the 2nd century, the Muratorian canon from Rome in the 150s. So that's only about 10 years after that we can date the Muratorian canon to.
That's
and we know
significant.
And we know it can't be the first time. I mean, we're not saying that the church didn't have it. It had a canon,
Right.
And it's finally being written down as you move it through the 2nd century. And
Or
that's
they're being more intentional of writing it down
Yeah.
because they've had this challenge.
And
right?
that's the natural process of the church. It's okay. You're bringing a question to us. Okay, well, let's give answer to it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then also this idea of the apostolic office not being something that was concentrated in just the apostles, but is something that is shared and passed down. That's significant. We can't look over that. Like, it's not just like this wild invention of later centuries. They're saying that, just like St. Paul says to Timothy, like, through the laying on of my hands, let another take his office in Acts, right? Like, the idea of the apostolic function in the church moving on. Archbishop Michael Ramsey, I think I brought this up before, but it's worth bringing up again. Because like Protestants will talk about, like, where's the threefold hierarchy in the scriptures? And they'll say there's just presbyters and deacons, right? There's no like single episcopate and all this stuff. It's like Michael Ramsey was great in this as an Anglican archbishop because he, of course, he's holding to the threefold hierarchy, and he says, well, you have three up and down the New Testament. You have the apostolate, the presbyterate, and the diaconate. Right? So the apostolate, and then all you have to do from there is show how the apostles passed that office right down.
Which the sources tell us is exactly what happened.
It's not like there's a gap. It's not like, there's like all of the, the New Testament is like just presbyters, whatever. And then there's this thing about Paul like laying his hands on, but is that just to make him a presbyter? We don't know. But I mean, we're talking immediately out of the New Testament. You have Ignatius of Antioch, right? You have Polycarp. You have Clement of Rome. Like you have you have Irenaeus. You have Justin Martyr. It's like it's never ending. I mean, you have the succession lists like appearing. They are intent on saying that the apostolic office has been passed down,
right? And
that this is going to be a safeguard, one of three, safeguards for the church, especially in this era, facing its first heresies.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about like the perspicuity of Scripture, for instance, Marcion is giving he's giving a systematic understanding of the Scriptures. He's looking at he's looking at the words of Scripture, and he's looking at all the debates that are floating around in the air in Judaism, all the debates floating around the air in philosophical schools, and he is attempting, one among many, to give a systematic understanding of these things. The book of reason, the book of nature, the book of Scripture, and he's bringing it all together. He's saying, this is what makes sense. These are not the same God. So if you're just doing a scriptural argument, a tit for tat, who's going to win? That's why you have to have that other thing. It's like, yes, the Scriptures. So we have our Scripture argument too, Marcion. Right? Just as X in the Old Testament, so now Y in the New. And it shows the unity of the Testaments. But we also, we're like incarnated. We are the church. Like, I mean, Peter's throne's right there, and that's the man sitting on it, and I'm in communion with him, and you're not. You were excommunicated from that church.
From them, yeah.
From Peter's throne. Right? I mean, and then and then you also have...
This mic doesn't drop, so...
Right, yeah. You also have... the creeds, yes, these authoritative confessions of faith. And by the way, right, like every Sunday when we stand up to proclaim the creed, I just want everybody to realize that how significant that first article is.
It's completely written against Marcion.
The entire thing is a refutation of Marcionism.
Yeah.
We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, the Creator of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. It's like you could not get more explicit in totally denying Marcionism.
And then his relationship to the Christ.
Yeah, exactly. And in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only Son of the Father. Yep. So it's like unity of the Testaments. That God of the Old Testament who created all things seen and unseen is the same God that Jesus comes to reveal. So it's, we can just take it for granted. We say the creed, but I hope that people, after listening to this episode, maybe next time they'll appreciate just that first article and the work that it took to get that,
the fight,
that article.
Yeah. I think the other takeaway as a Catholic is beware. Marcionism is alive and well.
Yeah.
It's gone away in the sense of, it's a parallel church. But the tendency to put a wedge between the Old Testament and the New. We often talk about liturgical Marcionism, in that somehow a lot of folks in the church have seen the Novus Ordo as this break from the past, and that's a good thing. Like, God has changed the way we worship. It's okay to change the way we worship the God who is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And our own church did take our liturgical tradition and carve and change.
Right.
So those who would take that and then abuse it, right, you're committing a Marcion of sorts.
Right.
Liturgically speaking.
Yeah. So I would say it's super insightful because you have not only that, you also have actual like Marcionism in a way. Like, okay, so for instance, like take like the historical critical, scholarly method of scripture, right? They love, like, when they write their books, talking about the Old Testament God as like this tribal warlord God, and then when they talk about Jesus, like the historical Jesus, like this hippie who goes around preaching
the laughing Jesus
justice
picture, whatever,
right?
the 1970s.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like in evangelical portrayals of Jesus, as opposed to the God of the Old Testament, who's like ritual and all these things. And Jesus comes kind of get rid of all that nonsense. And Jesus is sort of like, this. He kind of brings an egalitarianism of sorts, and that's why I'm saying that this revival of Marcionism seems to go straight back to the Reformation. I mean, it really does. You have law and gospel, this like sharp dichotomy and bifurcation between law and gospel. Now, Luther didn't go as far as Marcionism, but he does bring that up as a paradigm through which to understand the Christian message. Mm-hmm. And from there, it has ramifications for liturgy.
Well, they actually tore up the liturgies.
Exactly.
They actually tore up the theology of the liturgies.
They instituted a whole new cult of worship
Right.
because to them it was like, they even said like this is we're entering an age of light. That was an age of darkness now, right? Like, so they institute a whole new cult as if God didn't like to be worshipped the way that he was worshipped.
But this is why I don't want to be straight with people. We attend Novus Ordo,
right?
And even when the Tridentine wasn't taken away from us, we still mostly went to the Novus Ordo. I think the point we're trying to make is that we have to understand the Novus Ordo in continuity.
Yeah,
we have to read and worship in the Novus Ordo, and as we would read and worship in the Tridentine.
Otherwise, you're going to end up with what this one church on YouTube that I saw. It was a Catholic church. You're going to end up with this, where this priest, it was one of those happy clappy kind of Novus Ordo, like, things, but like he, went to give his sermon, his homily, and he said, "Now I want you guys to listen to this. Listen to this." And he went over to the Old Testament and he opened it up and he read the passage about like, I will visit the iniquity, onto the third and fourth generations, and I will smite you with the sword or whatever. And then he looks up and he goes, "Oh, come on. He's like, "If that's your God, that's not my God." He's like, "That's hyperbole. And then he starts talking about like, Jesus, and he starts quoting Jesus and like, this is the God like of love and mercy and all this stuff. You're like, whoa.
See, the great insight of the church, it seems, was we read Christ in every jot and tittle of the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And that includes the warrior.
Yeah.
Christ, the warrior, the judge. I mean, Revelation is the most frightening picture of the Christ. He's the same. Mm-hmm. It's the same. Mm-hmm. And so, unfortunately, when you get priests like that who are literally splitting up the gods again, anew, like Marcion would have. So I think the point is, we have to, the hermeneutic of continuity.
Yeah.
We have to hold that together. That to me was the travesty of the Tridentine being pushed to the side. It's good to have the Tridentine just prosper as it would prosper, because you need it as a bulwark to protect the Novus Ordo. That to me was the role of the Tridentine, as a protection of our worship. That's our model. That's our great ideal over all the centuries. Yeah. And the Novus Ordo is a piece of that. It's a part of that.
Well, yeah, the Tridentine Mass, I mean, being what it is judged in light of, just like all the other ancient liturgies, is judged in the light of the heavenly liturgy. Mm. But the Novus Ordo is judged in the light of the Tridentine. Yeah. The Novus Ordo is only as good as it is aligned to the Tridentine. Yeah. And that was Pope Benedict's great insight. Yeah. So again, to take that away and let the Novus Ordo run wild with its lack of rubrics and no direction on how we're supposed to celebrate this thing, you're going to end up with theological ramifications, and that's why you do kind of see Marcionism, whether it's Marcionism in the sense of like Jesus versus the Old Testament God in people's minds, or Jesus versus like post Vatican II Jesus versus pre Vatican II Jesus. Mm-hmm. There's kind of like a weird new
that
Jesus
ruled Jesus, the disciplining Jesus,
the Jesus that really liked rules and really beautiful worship, like that guy. Well, that guy's gone, and he likes Marty Hogan now.
Yeah,
that's the danger that we run into. And I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's the most recent document that came out, from the Vatican of Dignitas Infinita. Whatever. I'll let the theologians debate and do their thing, but there's one thing about this whole thing with the death penalty that I see, like, as just as somebody who studies patristics and the early church, is like this concept that the death penalty might be like intrinsically wrong. Now they don't say that, but they come darn close to saying that it's intrinsically wrong, and that it violates the inviolable. I mean, Pope Francis did use that word in many speeches, one on the floor of Congress in the United States. He said inviolable dignity. Like, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, infinite dignity. Okay, we can play with that, because there's going to be times then that even though humans have infinite dignity, you can take it away if they, do X, Y, or Z. But in this case, it's inviolable. Like, well, that means to not be able to take it away. Mm-hmm. So, then you have ramifications for like, well, then can God send people to hell? Or will that be a violation of their inviolable dignity? Or this death penalty thing. Well, the God of the Old Testament is the one who commanded the death penalty. So how could the God of the New say that, not only that we don't do it anymore for whatever reasons, but that it's wrong?
Yeah.
That introduces the idea of a disunity of the testaments, right? In my view. So like that's a dangerous idea that we're kind of a lot of the Catholics are playing with right now. And I think Marcion, like getting our roots back down into the early church and remembering why we thought these things in the first place.
Right. There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
There's no new sin. There's no new whatever. So doing the first 500-year series, we'll continue to see that these things continue to pop up just with a different face maybe here and there. So the warning to us Catholics to be vigilant, I guess.
Right.
I think that was the only thing you want to say on that. The last thing you want to say on that.
No.
So
I'm
good. The final thing I would say is at a time when the church could have chosen something simpler, they could have taken the easy road, and said, "Yeah, you know what? That Old Testament's tough to interpret. It's tough to deal with. Mm-hmm. Maybe Marcion's right. It's easier that way. He's winning converts. They're dying at the hands of the Romans." The church in this moment chose complexity over simplicity. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great lesson to us, that they were not willing. Give me the complexity. Give me the difficulty.
We'll deal with the tension.
We'll deal with the tension, because I'm not willing to throw something out that may be apostolic, that may be revelation. I'm not willing to do that. Right. I'd rather try and figure out the tension and hold it all together in our grand tradition.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I think like Newman would have appreciated, because Newman talks about that a lot too, that the church doesn't always, the church doesn't take the obvious route. Every time that it's been given, that it was given that opportunity, it doesn't take that route. Because something else was guiding its decision making. Something else was guiding its ability to decide what was orthodox and what was heresy.
Yeah, because and we'll get into it obviously, but you're referencing like some of the Christological arguments. It seemed like the better interpretation may even have been that.
Like Arius was like, maybe that's an easier way out of this tension, right?
Right. Yeah. But no, there's something driving at the Grillmeyer says that too. Christ and Christian Tradition, his volumes on Christology.
That's a must read, by the way, for everybody.
Yeah. I think he makes that exact point, is that there's just something else pushing the church and saying, nah, that's not it.
That's not it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not it. So yeah, great insight there.
Cool. So, well, that's Marcion. Hope everybody enjoyed that discussion. I do want to point people to some sources, just a couple, so that people can get their feet wet if they really want to read some more. There is a new book that came out by Judith Liu. It's called Marcion and the Making of a Heretic, God and Scripture in the Second Century. It's just like There's a lot of stuff in here. I do want to warn you, though, it's not like a biographical sketch of Marcion or anything like that. It's really talking about how Marcion is portrayed in the works of the apologists. And it's a pretty dense like work of history. So if this is your jam, this is a good place to go.
But it is the most updated. It's I think the newest monograph on Marcion. So
right, yeah. So this is a really good one. The other one is Bernard Green. Honestly, Christianity in Rome. There's just like, I know it's short, but like there's just like a little section on Marcion that's really helpful for people to like have an introduction to Marcion. Another good one is like the Encyclopedia of the Early Church, I think is what it's called. But I recommended that in earlier episodes too. It's great to have that, just the entry on Marcionism, because in there at the end he has a bunch of books and articles that you can grab to get into some.
Yeah, go on JSTOR too. There's at least 3 or 4 good articles on Marcion on JSTOR. Mm-hmm. What's the other one? Oh, Justo Gonzalez, the basic introduction of Christian tradition, gives a good overview of Marcion.
And then the primary sources, obviously. I mean, Tertullian wrote 5 books against Marcion.
Yeah. And again, book 4, concentrate on book 4.
Yeah.
Where a lot of the meat is. But yeah, if you want primary source, it's Tertullian for sure.
Yeah. So I hope that helps you guys if you want to do some more reading into this topic. But for now, that's Marcion. And so we're going to be going to our next topic in the first 500 years. We will have a couple of other episodes too with some guests, just like we've started to have. We had a great episode with Ben Bollinger, Eric Ibarra. So we're going to continue that too, because we seem to see that there was a lot of really good conversations stimulated there. But for now, that's it, and we'll see you in the next episode of the first 500 years.